We're going to talk about what is to develop components in isolation, when would you want to do that, and some tools that you can use to help you in this regard. Before I start, a few words about me. My name is Andrei Pfeiffer. I work as a co-designer here at Espresso, mostly on front-end technologies and UI development. I'm also an event organizer for tim.js, the JavaScript meetup, and the Revo.js, the JavaScript conference. And from time to time, I write articles on Medium, technical ones, mostly about React Native and JavaScript. So this is like a very simple and typical setup for most web applications. You have a UI that's connected to some API, and which pulls data from a database, right? This is probably most of your applications are more or less something like this. Well, there are some examples or some use cases or some more complex systems, and I'm going to talk about two of those more complex systems that I worked previously in order to, better understand the use cases where this isolated component stuff is suited for. So the UI, API, and database, we all have those in our more complex systems. But in the first application, the API actually used the database only to cache some stuff that pulled from some Lambda functions that were connected to some GitHub repositories that pulled the data from GitHub, all the files, and then send all the files to be processed by a lot of workers, and then the data will be streamlined back to the API. So you wouldn't be able to use the actual application without an internet connection, without being connected to Lambda. All these workers took a long time to process that data. So the data that you got in the UI is very inconsistent. Like, you didn't know exactly what your data would look like. Like you couldn't be able to actually put some data in there very easily, right? It wasn't trivial because the data was coming from these Lambda functions. Another example was also we got a UI connected to an API, connected to a database, right? But the data in the database was posted from a different API, which was a public one, because all those from there were like some sort of closed, private system. There was another public API that consumers were connected to and actually made a post request. And the post requests were posted then to an engine, which also sends some work to a bunch of workers that scrape the internet, scrape some pages, and did a lot of stuff, and then report it back to the database so you have the data available in your UI. So in both projects, the way that data was displayed in the UI came from a very non-trivial system, right, or non-trivial workflow. So in development, how do we connect our UI to an API and to get the data from a database? Well, from my experience, I work with 3 different ways to do that. One way is to directly connect your UI to a remote server. A server that gets the code deployed to staging environment or a dev environment or somewhere on the internet, on some server. Then you get connected to it directly. The benefit is that you, as a UI developer, you don't have to do any local setup, right? I really like that because I don't like that infrastructure stuff, DevOps, networking. Okay. The data provisioning, for instance, when I say data provisioning, I mean if we are multiple developers or a team of developers, we all work on the same database, right? We all connect our UIs to the same server. So if you, for instance, have a problem and you want me to replicate the problem, it's going to be very easy for me because we all work with the same data, right? Now the problem in this with this approach is the codes. How do you code the sync? How do you sync the code? Sorry, and because anytime you want to push some updates to that staging server or whatever type of server it is, somebody has to do a deployment. Deployments, well, they can fail, right? You have to fix stuff only to get some data pushed to the development server. Also, it's not trivial to, for instance, deploy a specific branch or to create a pull request and you want to be connected to a different branch, not a master branch or develop branch or whatever. So it's not trivial to do that. In one project, we'd have like a dedicated DevOps or infrastructure team that did only the tooling and the deployment and provided us the tooling in order to be able to deploy different branches on different servers. So it's a full-time job in order to have that luxury. And of course, you need an online internet connection in order to be connected to the server, right? Now, a different approach would be to install all the system locally on your machine. You get a benefit because you can work offline, right? Code sync, like when anybody pushes some code updates, you can very easily check out and start your system locally from any branch, because everything you do is like isolated to your computer. The problem is that how do you get the data into the database? For instance, you have a specific setup and you want me to replicate something that, I don't know, you have on your own server. So you have to basically export the database, send it to me, I have to import it, I have to run migrations maybe. So it's not trivial to synchronize the data so we all, in order to work on the same data set. Also, you have to maintain the system setup locally. You have to do migrations, all that kind of stuff. I also don't like this. I put this in orange because Docker really helps you in this regard. Like, really helps you because you only push one button or maybe two buttons, and you have everything set up locally. Now, I also had some problems, even with Docker, memory problems and that kind of stuff. When you have large system, you get into troubles. Another approach I've used for one mobile application was to use a fake server. So basically, you create a local server that intercepts the request and returns some stopped data, so you can work with that. It has the benefits of working offline, just like the previous scenario, and the data provisioning is like really trivial because you can stop with any data you want, right? Because you control everything. The problem is that you have manually keep in sync the schema of the response with any updates that are on the actual server, right? So that's, again, not trivial to do. Now, I don't know if you have any other approaches to this regard. These are the three major ones that, or the only three that I came across during my career, let's say. So each of them have some trade-offs and some benefits. Now, it will be ideal that me as a UI developer, I don't care about APIs and databases and deployments and that kind of stuff. It would be really ideal. So to break like this connection between the UI and the API. But that's not enough. We also need to isolate our component. Because let's say that we have an application tree of different components, right? And we want to add a new component somewhere very deeply into the guts of our application, in our application tree. And let's say that this component is connected to some store and connects the data from somewhere. I don't know exactly from where. And I'm gonna use a specific use case or specific problem that I had on the previous project. So there was one component that fetched some data from the API, and some part of this data was an S3 URL. Now, an S3 URL is S3 is like from AWS, like a storage something, a CDN, where you can store files. But this one was a private URL, so you didn't have direct access to the assets. So another component that was an image model, so we have to display the image behind that URL because it was an image, made another request to the API, to another endpoint that made another request to AWS S3, which streamed the image back to the UI in a base 64 format, right? So only to develop that small component there, I need to basically run the entire application and rely on the API, which relied on AWS S3, right? And I have to have a valid S3 URL and that kind of stuff. So it was really a lot of dependencies. So it was really, I mean, I only had to develop like one small component, right? And we can develop like really only that component into isolation when we know exactly the contract or the data that it really needs. All it needed was a base 64 image, right? This is like basically the same what we do in unit testing. When we unit test classes or modules or functions, we basically take them out of the entire application and we run them in isolation. So we can develop entire modules, entire classes without actually needing the entire application, right? And after that, when everything works great, hopefully it will work when we integrate in the application as well, if the contract is like really strong, right? Okay, so in regard to UI development, there are two main tools that help us develop this like practice this kind of approach. There is Storybook and React Style Guidist. I've used both of them, each of these tools on a different project. So Storybook, it says about itself that it's a UI development environment and playground for UI components. Storybook is, you can find implementations for any framework that you could possibly learn in a lifetime. So it's available like for everything. This is in contrast with the React Style Guidist. I mean, the name implies that it's only for React. And this is like an isolated React component development environment with a living style guide. So let me show you like briefly show you like what are the differences between the two of them. Okay. So this is a small example project. Okay, let's start with the Storybook. So the Storybook has a config, it usually stores all its files into the .storybook folder. And you have like a small config where you can import stuff from Storybook/React or whatever framework are you using. You can also import any third-party CSS files or third-party libraries that you can use. And you load some stories. Now, what are the stories? Well, there are some JS files that looks like this. So it looks like a unit test, right? You import your components, and then you can import anything else like util methods or util modules. And then you have some API that's provided by Storybook. You write stories of, blah, blah, blah. And then you add like a section with buttons. So in the button section, you basically specify what components do you want to render in isolation, right? And you can render the same components with different props and that with different values, different combinations. So you get, you start a server and you get this UI where you have your components rendered, right? You have these two buttons, different states, and also this image model that I told you about. You can render it with different states, like a loading state and a loaded state, also with a download image. This download image action was really this is basically the feature that I needed this way of developing, because you need to basically take the entire base 64 code and somehow push it or make the browser or send it to the browser to download it to make it available for download. So everything regarding this component was developed without an internet connection, in complete isolation, and when I integrated it into the application, miraculously it worked like out of the box. So yeah, I really enjoyed it, because otherwise it would have been very difficult for me to develop this kind of component. Also so back to Storybook, you see that when you select one component from there, basically you see only one type of components one time on the screen. You will see that it's different with Style Guidist. You also get a lot of add-ons with the Storybook. For instance, one cool add-on is to render all the possible combinations, or considering all the props for a React component, or for, I guess, other components in other frameworks as well. So it's pretty great if you want to, I don't know, like see all the combinations, not manually render them, or to add them manually in the stories. Also, you got a lot other add-ons. You can create your own add-ons, so it's very flexible and very extendable, because you can basically extend the Storybook. Let me show you just one small add-on, for instance. It's a more useful one. It adds here a button, show info, that shows you like information about the component that you render. It reads some of the props from where you define the component. It shows you the source code, and but yeah, it looks very strange, because it's not very pretty. And when I change to another component, it hides, so I have to click again, and yeah, it's not very friendly. Okay, let's take a look at Style Guidist. Style Guidist also has one config. You specify the webpack config if you want to. It's not mandatory. You tell it where to read the components from. So I tell it to all my JSX files to be included in the style guide, and then you can add some additional libraries if you have. For instance, I use Semantic UI. You might use Bootstrap or something else. You can skip components without an example. We'll see in a second what that means. The way you write these examples in Style Guidist is very different. Basically, for each component, you see here I have the button JSX component. You have to have a markdown file with the same name, and you basically can parse that markdown file in order to render it to the UI. So a markdown file is something very simple, where you define like what do you want to render on the screen. The button component with different props, or the image model component. You can also include some third-party or some external utility modules, and you can use them in your components. And you get, of course, a server that you have all the components here, but on one page. By default, you get all on one page. Of course, this might be a problem when you have a lot of components, but you can make this optionally. You can render just like a storybook, only one component at a time on the screen. What you also get out of the box, and I really like that, you get these props and methods, which are more nicely displayed and with more information than what you get in Storybook. And you get this view code where you get editable code, like you can edit it right in place, and you can see, for instance, how that button renders if you have a lot of text. So you don't have to, I don't know, update the story files or the source code or whatever. You can do it all in this UI. Unfortunately, there are no plugins for Style Guidist. So it does more out of the box. You have many more configuration options, but you cannot extend it yourself. That's like one of the big differences between the two of them. But there are some other benefits you get from, I don't know, this kind of development approach. Now, how many of you have looked over some code and said to yourself, like, this is shitty code, like, who the fuck did this? And then you go to see, like, who did it, and it was you, like, some time ago. It happened to me. But also, did it ever happen to you to write some code and then the very next day you look over your code and you think it's shitty? This also happened to me, and I think this happens because of I don't know. You see the code from a different perspective. Like you are probably when you are stressed, then you are not focused enough in order to see all the problems related to your code. When you come back the next day, maybe you are I don't know. Your mind is clearer. Then you can see, wow, this is like how the heck did I write this, right? But also when it comes to components or to UI in general, when you have like a large UI, that entire tree of components, of course, your focus is not gonna be on a specific part of that entire file because you're looking at the entire file, right? So it's very difficult to see the problems when you see the entire forest of trees, right? When you develop, from my experience, when I develop these components in isolation, like you see only the component, you don't see anything else. So you focus only on that component. And my personal experience is that I write better APIs, and when I say API, I said the interface of the component, like how the component is named, how do I name the props or the methods or that kind of stuff, like how, because I use only that particular component, and yeah, it's like you see it from a different perspective. Also, you get out of the box this style guide, which is like a library of components, which is really helpful if there are multiple developers working on the same project. Other ones or new developers don't have to reinvent the wheel because they can look at this style guide and see, okay, what components are already available in the application. This is not a, I mean, for Storybook is not very good for this kind of, for being a style guide. You can make it be a style guide, but it wasn't made specifically with that in mind. React Style Guide is on the other hand, has as its primary focus is to be a style guide, and only a secondary to be like a isolated component development something. Okay, so a few conclusions comparing these two libraries side by side. The integration for Storybook, everything. For React Style Guide is only React. There is a fork for Vue, but I don't know exactly what the status is there. Plugins, you got a lot of plugins for Storybook, none for React Style Guidist. They wanted to add this into the library, but apparently for more than a year it wasn't any development in that regard, so I guess we won't have that. Writing examples, how you write examples and stories. In Storybook, you write them in pure JavaScript using a specific API from Storybook. In React Style Guide is to use Markdown in order to write your examples. And the main purpose of Storybook is to develop UI components, to test them, to debug them. React Style Guide is more into the documentation of components kind of stuff. You can do the other with you can do both with each of the libraries, but the main purpose is like a bit different. Also, there are different ways you can use either of these tools. Like you can use them if you are a team of multiple developers. Only one developer can use it locally. And not even push it or check it out on GitHub, right? You don't have to commit it. You can have it installed only locally, and you can, I don't know, render components in isolation. You can develop them, and then you can integrate it into the application. You can also check them into the Git repository, and then other developers can also do this kind of stuff as well. The third step would be to build the entire library of components. So you can, I don't know, provide, you can have a public link somewhere in order to, I don't know, consumers of your library to be able to see them. So that's a third step that you can also take in this regard. Do you have any questions? Like this was all I had for today. So if you have any questions.
I have several.
Okay.
I've played with Storybook.
With Angular, right?
yes, and
Okay.
another option for Angular, but I can't remember it right now because I use Storybook more.
Docs?
Maybe. Okay, never mind. Let's say you add this to a project. Would you add all the components there, or only like the generic ones? So you would only like add button, or if you have one specific thing, component that you used it in one place, but you know you do best practices and it's extracted as a component, would you add it also to Storybook or Storybook?
Well,
And the question is only general stuff or everything?
The button component, like it was obviously general, like a very reusable component. That image model wasn't an image model until I started developing in Storybook. It was called previously a screenshot model because I only use it in one place. So that's what I was saying. Like when you develop it in isolation, you see it differently. And at first, I thought that I can only use it in one place because that's the only place I needed it. And actually, it wasn't like a screenshots model. It was like a more generic image model because you can display like any kind of image, not only screenshots. Because yeah. So to develop, like you can develop like any component that is a pure component, a dumb component that doesn't rely on any external data source. So yeah, I started to do that with a very very specific component. So yeah, you can do that. I would do that. And for me, the biggest advantage was that I wasn't I didn't need to rely on an external or all the setup of the application and the APIs and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And if you have Storybook or React this your application or to already existing medium-sized application, what kind of investment are we talking about? Like time, money? Because I've tried to set up Storybook for a larger project and it wasn't that straightforward for me. And continuing to work with Angular and TypeScript and all that ceremony with setting everything up, it was like trying to set up NGRX or something. It was like a lot of things that need to be done and code to add there just to have this kind of setup done.
Oh yeah, okay.
So that was my opinion, but I'm curious if you experienced something else.
Well, I only use them, both of them, with the React projects. So, and without TypeScript. Yeah, I know.
No, but for Angular, right, we tried to do it as well, and after 2 days I gave up.
I did something similar. So because the idea is awesome. Like, yeah, I want to develop components in isolation. It's great, but at some point I was okay. I wasted enough time trying to make this work. So it was just create that component as I did with the other 100 components. And move on.
No, and going back to the previous project, to the first one with the Lambda functions, imagine that the result from that Lambda processing functions were some Git diffs or Git patches, and that we needed to display in the UI, and you could edit them as well. And so how could you do development and or debugging? So how could you replicate a problem when you rely on a server that you don't know exactly what's going to send, when it's going to send something, and you wanting the data to be in a specific way, right? And yeah, it was impossible to do that without something like this. Not necessarily Storybook or React Style or whatever, but yeah, to develop like in isolation. It was really crazy and impossible. I mean, not impossible, but yeah, you get the picture. So yeah, in specific situation, like I don't say that you should do this in any type of project or any kind of projects, but in projects where your UI is usually connected to some APIs that return unpredictable data, then yeah, it's priceless.
Well, if you create a component library, this is great.
Or that as well. Or that as well.
That should be used company-wide or anything like that. And
yeah.
Having something like this is almost mandatory because you need something.
Yeah. In that, exactly, in that regard as well. I didn't have much problems setting any of those up with the React projects. But of course, the projects are not with a lot of dependencies and TypeScript support, or I don't know. Because you, for React Style Guide, is basically you provide the webpack config, and whatever hanky-panky you have should be in that webpack config usually. So it reuses that webpack config and theoretically should work as expected. Other questions? No?
What's Riot and the last logo?
Sorry?
What's Riot and the last logo? It's Andrei Pfeiffer.
The last logo is Mithril.
Okay. And Riot?
And Riot is like I have no idea. It's a isn't it like backend? It's a React? No.
Yeah, it's like a 2 kilobyte React kind of thing. That's
Right.
how it started.
Not the
It's
React
some-
now?
yeah,
Riot.
That's how it started.
Yeah.
No. It's
Yeah,
something
it's
like
something similar
React.
to React.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's like React. I guess.
Oh okay.
I haven't seen them before.
Yeah, I heard about it a lot, but I have no idea what it is actually. Yeah, and Storybook you can. That was like really impressive for me because you can use it with vanilla JavaScript, like with HTML5 components.
You mean web components like Shadow DOM and stuff, or like
I'm-
shown on screen?
I'm not entirely sure about that.
Okay.
I think
Components have a different logo, so I don't.
I think I checked out the documentation, but it didn't say anything about Polymer or web components or.
Not Polymer, just web components in general. I mean, throw something there, pure JavaScript with Shadow DOM and register it as an element, and then can you use it?
I don't know exactly. I don't know.
Because it's a great way to actually create, as I said, a company-wide style guide with some reusable components, and actually web components is a good thing for this.
Yeah.
Large companies do not only use React or Angular, they probably use other frameworks,
Multiple.
older ones or newer ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They support Polymer components.
They support?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Well, and some probably really like which would work.
Cool. So, thank you very much. You can check me out on GitHub, Twitter, Medium, and see you. You can join us for beers. We're gonna go have some and some wine and some
See you
more.
in 5 minutes.
Yeah. So thank you.
That's it.